I burnt out doing things that were a little against the grain for me. So I stepped out for 6 months and my partner said, look, you're designed to found, you're designed to be self-employed. When are you going to believe in yourself and just do it? So I did. I started that journey.
You're listening to Not My First Guess. I'm Hattie Willis, your host, and each episode I talk to an entrepreneur, investor, or startup expert to unpack their hardest moments, biggest wins, and hard-earned advice so we can shortcut our learnings as founders together.
Today I'm joined by Victoria Armstrong, angel investor, advisor, and mentor. Victoria is an inspiring player on and off the pitch, with an impressive entrepreneurial background of 20 years worth of experience in rapidly growing startups, including Biotech, mental health, and SaaS, and has the stories to prove it. She's invested her journey across 3 very different markets, New Zealand, the US, and the UK, in 7 different startups, 4 of which she either founded or co-founded and exited, with 1 being acquired out of the US. Victoria now holds multiple board and advisory positions in various tech businesses and immensely enjoys helping others become founder fit to have a sustainable journey of their own. Oh, and she also happens to be one of the board advisors for our favourite Female Founders Rise. In this episode, we discuss exposing unconscious bias, especially your own, nurturing business and human babies in tandem, why it takes a village to raise a business, calling your A-team before a crisis hits, how to create psychological safety with external stakeholders, and stepping away from the founder identity. So without further ado, let's get started.
So, welcome to the show, Victoria.
Hattie, what a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I'm so excited because every time we chat, I just come away buzzing. So I think that's going to be the vibe for listeners at the end of today's episode.
Well, it's that whole natural energy from me and I'll try and temper it. So there you go.
No, don't you dare. Let's get in. There's a lot to cover. You have done a lot in your career so far, and I know there'll be a lot we want to dive deeper on, but let's get started with your story. So you've been founding, scaling, and advising businesses since 2003. How did you first become a founder?
I burnt out in the corporate world, and burnout comes from lots of different ways, but basically too much change. I fractured ankles and my whole identity was around my physical prowess at that stage in life, being a high achiever on a netball court, etc. So lots of change, new relationships, moving into an area like sales that I didn't like too much, even though I was okay at it. And I burnt out doing things that were a little against the grain for me. So I stepped out for 6 months and my partner said, look, you're designed to found, you're designed to be self-employed. When are you going to believe in yourself and just do it? So I did. I started that journey.
That's so incredible that I think there is actually quite a common thread for founders, that there is someone beside you that can say, like she said, that prompt to believe in yourself. And it was something we spoke quite a lot about with Lauren's episode of sometimes we have these internal narratives that tell us we can't do it. Did you have some of those at play that your partner, it took her saying that for you to believe that you could?
100%. She knows me very well. We've been together 23 years now. And at that stage, even though we're early on, she got a sense of the type of character I was and the things that fulfilled me, and a bit of a go-getter. I went and got her, which was part of my story of life. And I think she just knew that there were certain character traits that meant there's a tenacity and a perseverance. And if I was given a little bit of a kick up the bum at the right time, which was not immediately when I burnt out, but a bit more self-belief, and I'd probably just brave it. And therefore I did. She was fantastic at that time. I needed to hear it.
Amazing. And so tell us about your first idea and how you worked out that was the idea worth pursuing.
At the time, if I was going to go and brave it, I felt I needed to fall on the things that I knew best. And I trained for a long time at the university in New Zealand in health sciences and nutrition and all these things. So I thought I'll do what I do best, what I know best, and it was in the health sector. So I set up a health business called U Health, and that went for 3 years and had a nice early exit. But I got a little bit bored by that, in that a lot of output as a founder, I didn't want to what's the word? Yeah, I didn't like the model. It didn't suit me so much, the lack of potential in it. And so I thought I'll just go and do something differently. So I did.
I love that. And I think it's something that maybe first-time founders, it's really easy to forget when you're in that process of forgetting, because businesses pivot so much as they need to, right? It's really rare that the idea stays in the exact same form we first conceive it. But I think what's really easy to do, and I think maybe easier to do even more so when you have investors on board, is to just pursue the path that is commercially viable, but lose the love. Is that what happened with you?
With that one, I lost the love because I had learned how to start, bring a team on board, build a brand, deliver fantastic value to customers, all really quickly in a very simple business model. And so I lost the love for the fact that, it wasn't a tech business. And so I didn't find it that challenging after 3 years. And I didn't want to franchise it, which was the natural next step. Yeah, I lost the love. And meanwhile, I was getting excited by other people wanting to work with me in some other areas. And so I naturally just went to market. Someone took it and decided, let's do another business. And that one was called Fit to Front, being fit to front up and be your authentic, natural self, no matter who your stakeholder. So whether it's in front of television, whether it's your team that you're leading, investors, or on a board, how do you be fit to front up and engage naturally and authentically for the better outcome? That was a fantastic business. I really enjoyed that too.
And I would love to dig into that, because I think there's so much probably for founders to take maybe from some of the principles that you were teaching there. We were talking before the call about how it's really hard to be going out and pitching a business if you can't be authentically yourself.
Yeah.
And growing teams is really hard. But I want to come back to that. I just want to first ask, were there any big lessons? So that first business, you learned a ton in 3 years.
Yeah.
Were there any big takeaways that you took into your second business that you kind of had to go through the hard way?
Yeah, probably more the third business. And a lot of it is probably around co-founding, picking the right co-founders, learning, bringing on the right expertise, such as governance, the legal, the accounting piece, not shying from that up front. Getting those fundamental pieces in place is really important. And it's hard because you don't want to dig into your pockets. For me, it was all about, I just want to sell. I just want to please customers. I want to make a good business, bring in money, and serve people well. So at different businesses, I've learned some fundamental pieces. To your first point around the first business to the second business, no, not so much. But that second business was around, I co-founded from there on. So those are probably the biggest learnings, is how to co-found, how to manage those relationships, and how to set them up for success at the front end. I would do differently.
And it's fascinating you say that, because often we talk about kind of serial entrepreneurship. And I think often founders coming into from the beginning will hear like, oh, well, you're a first time founder, you're going to make so many mistakes. And my observation has been like, actually, I think it takes a few probably businesses to get coverage of a lot of the common mistakes, because you can have a first business that goes pretty well and it's easier. And then it's, as you say, your third business that's harder.
Yeah, 100%. I think the third business was probably my most challenging. Fourth business was emotionally most draining. But the thing that I think, why is it worth pursuing, is that if you are values aligned with your co-founders and you understand that stuff up front and you're mission driven, you have some sense of excitement or a tingle about why you want to go into that business, and it's not just the person, it's the product, it's the customers, then I think there's something about that lining up with your values and those pieces that just says, I'm ready to do this and I've just got to give it everything. I think for me, the third business was the most testing around that. I'd understood a few of the fundamentals after 2. And what drove me was around team, very family centric. I liked high growth and commercializing things. I also like to scare myself and challenge myself quite extremely. And I like to push the boundaries. And so to have characters that want to be around that understand that, is not so easy to find. But I did find them. And it went on to some good stuff as well in the end.
So let's talk about Fit to Front, such a fascinating space. Are there lessons that, having run that business and seen a lot of people struggling with that authenticity piece, Are there any thoughts that you have on, and obviously your experiences since then, and you're an angel investor as well, so I know you see a lot of founders, but particularly on that kind of how founders can work to feel more comfortable, and also how those of us supporting them in different roles in the ecosystem, so whether it's an investor taking meetings, how we can do more to, or accelerators, how we can do more to support founders to be able to be their upfront selves, because actually it's not always just on the individual, it's on the systems as well, like we spoke about with Lauren.
It's not. You're right. And this is something we were talking about yesterday at Female Founders Rise at Google, around how do we support founders, and not necessarily just female founders. There's so many different ways of doing it, but the things that I've learned around the authenticity piece is it takes years of experience, and that's something you don't get at the front end clearly, to be able to be so comfortable in your own skin that you know what that means, and that you can bring that self to every appointment, whatever it looks like. And so there's often a confidence piece that isn't, or that's seen at the front end as being a lack of confidence. And it's hard to engage when you're feeling pulled outside of yourself a little bit, right? So I spend a lot of time nowadays, I feel, giving people a license to be themselves and trying to understand what that means, or helping them understand what that means. And we're organic people, and our businesses should thrive organically through us as well, because we're such an important lever to its growth, or to its sustainability, or to how it fits in the world. And so to be able to help someone be organically and authentically themselves, you need to touch on these pieces, like not just finances and business models and voice work. It's about a sense of yourself, a sense of your spirituality, a sense of how the relationships are feeding you or not feeding you in life and in work and in play. And all these pieces are really important to being what I call founder fit. That's a tough thing to have at the front end of starting a connection point in any relationship, right? But I think these are questions that we need to ask ourselves in a more sort of holistic way. And I think investors and people on the other side are starting to get it. Not many do, but we have to be brave about talking about it too. So I think it's beholden on both sides to actually start that sort of dialogue, and not just front it for the sake of it, but bring some pieces of that to the conversation as well.
And I loved, just before the call, we were talking about your mic drop moment at a recent talk, and how actually it was, we were saying, and I'd love you to tell the story, but I think as we listen, it's one of those where I think you and I were both shocked about sometimes how much these things shock an audience, because it's in our day-to-day discussions quite regularly, but such an important conversation to be having. Maybe you could tell that story.
Sure. I was on a panel for Le French Tech about 3 weeks ago. It was at the French Embassy. And the panel was around how to lift up women, how to help them step into leadership roles. And there was a blend of the corporate on the panel and the startup, myself and another guy. And at the French Embassy, everything's very beautifully honed with big chandeliers and amazing, probably 4,000 odd prints on the wall that is older than my country, New Zealand. So it's pretty inspiring in some ways. We're talking this one piece, and I chimed in at the end, and it was around unconscious bias. And I held the mic and I said, I am a 50-year-old woman that is gay, and I love it when I'm called out on my unconscious bias by people half my age. Because this is about change, right? Pause. No noise. No commentary. Next question. So I thought that was very interesting. Following that, in the chat afterwards, I would have had 4 or 5 people come up and go, that was amazing. No one does that. No one talks about it. And I was like, really? Okay. They were shocked. A lot of them were shocked.
And it's something we were speaking about in regards to the episode we ran at Sifted Summit, where we had 3 incredible founders talking about different ways that founders can be underrepresented. So from color, sexuality, and gender. And we were talking about Nick, who really opened my eyes when we were recording that episode to some of the things that as a straight woman, I've never had to think about, right? If I say, oh, my partner, people assume it's a guy and it's easy and I'm not having to out myself at any point in that conversation. So I think we need more people like you to be opening our eyes, but then we also need to be actively leaning into like, how do we not just rely on other people to open our eyes? How do we put more thought into our interactions so that we're not making these assumptions along the way? So I think what you're doing is super powerful.
And you know what? I've gone through this for so many times in so many different events. Yesterday was no different. A lovely woman came up to me and it was a similar situation. And so what does your husband say, Victoria? And I assume he's from Australia too. So I'm married to a woman and I'm a New Zealander. And that poor woman, I just paused and I just started laughing. And I said, I'm never going to forget your name. And she's worn it in the last 24 hours. And we've had a fantastic dialogue on LinkedIn, back and forth in messaging. So she won't do that again. But we had a laugh because that's what you got to do. You can't take these things too seriously.
And I think you're spot on as well with the mindset of wanting your unconscious bias to be exposed, because I think too many of us are still in that defensive place. And I include myself in this sometimes, where we get called out and we want to rush to somehow make an excuse for why we said it. And the truth is, like, we just said it because we've internalized all these ideas and not give it any thought because we haven't had to. And that is the only answer. And the only way through it is to push through that really deep discomfort of, oh my gosh, this is mortifying. Okay, I've got to learn from it. I can't do that again.
100%. And I'm not, I'm too long in the tooth to care too much about those things anymore. But I also I'm in a position where I can bring that unconscious bias to a discussion point. And there were 4 other women around and they were like, oh, but then they're like, no, actually, you're right. And it was very light, very easy.
So I took us off on a tangent there, but I think a really important one. Coming back to so we were on your second idea and we were talking about that authenticity piece, which was super connected to where we went. So you finished that second idea. What's the transition to the third idea? What makes you move on? And then we're going to get into, I think you said the third idea is almost where the challenges really hit.
Yeah, well put. So why the third idea? Again, the second idea with Fit to Front, for me, it wasn't going to be delivering the dreams or visions of my life the way I wanted to. The model was too restricting. It was about employing people and consultants and contractors and filling a need and servicing, right? And so I sat back and I thought, what is the stuff that I really want to do? I want to buy into another business and really challenge myself. We're talking early 2000s at this stage. And I realized that as much as I didn't know how to spell tech, perhaps I should jump into it a little bit. So I did, and I researched a few different tech businesses, and there happened to be one that was just starting out called Who's on Location. And it had a founder, a guy called Darren, who had played basketball for New Zealand, tick team, had a young family, fantastic family, really open and transparent, tick. So really a ballsy guy, a go-getter, tick. And it had global potential. This whole model and everything I knew was going to go into the cloud and do all these amazing things. So I bought into the company's third employee and basically co-founded very early on and was in that business for 8 years. So for me, it ticked the values box. The danger piece was that I was 3 months pregnant and 38. And then we're going, right, I had to really second guess, am I going to go in and have 2 babies here? Because I knew what it was going to take, having done it twice before. So lots of challenges even in that front end of it.
And how do you navigate that? Because actually a while ago, I asked the question on LinkedIn. I don't know if I've ever had a post with so many responses to say female founders or any founder who's a parent, but particularly female founders who are going through the pregnancy aspect on top of the childcare aspect. How do you even do it? Because I am not, before any listeners get excited, thank you very much, I'm not there. Don't leap. But I am really intrigued, right? Like down the line, that's something I would love to think about. And
Sure.
I want to understand how founders have done it, because I look at it and I just objectively don't get it. And it was one of those things where the responses were so heartfelt, a mixture of, yeah, you just do it and you just make it work and you're back in the office 3 days later. Some people further down their career were able to make more allowance for it or had more teams in place. Some people were just also really worried about it. And I think we've maybe got into a position where, I wonder anyway, because we're trying to drive for equality in investment, and it is a really unhelpful question to my mind still for investors to ask, what are your family plans? It's not okay. That's what they're asking. But we need to be able to push back on that at the same time as actually being able to have conversations about how we support founders who are going through pregnancy and parenting, because it is just a different toll, right?
It is. It's the biggest challenge of my life. It's the hardest role and the most fulfilling role, and in so many different ways. So I'll come to your last point. I would love there to be a world where investors and founders, because you want the right investors on your cap table for the long haul, that you can have that conversation up front once you've got a sense that those values align, that you can have that conversation up front. Because until you can do that, you're actually playing with fire. You really are. Because there is no simple rule or playbook for how you do it. I can tell you my story, and it is layered with highs and lows and pitfalls and consequences. And I'm happy to share that briefly. And I think the answer is for founders, just be upfront. Investors, open your hearts to the fact that this is reality. Parenting is reality if they choose to. It's just another challenge and demand in our world of growing a business, right?
And I think it's one of those things where until we talk about it, it's hard to be pragmatic. And actually, like, there is, if you, to your point, how do we not just get into this? I think the thing we're all slightly scared of by having that conversation is that we become a worse investment case. I'm going to either need to take more salary because I need to pay for more childcare, or I'm going to just be missing, or I'm not going to want to come back, is always the fear of it. And there's so much. And I still remember, I think I was realizing, gone through a friends having children, and it's made me realize how much I'd internalized from, I still remember my mum telling me when I was younger, oh, you'll have a kid, you won't want to go back to work. And so many people saying that at the time. And I watch all my friends and like, they want to go back to work. And if they don't, that's fine too. But actually, like, my experience has been very differently weighted. And I think so much wrapped up in identity and career. And that for me feels much closer to what I expect. But I guess there's this fear that I would have having that upfront conversation of, are you then as an investor worrying this is going to cost me more? There's a bigger risk in the business. So would love your take as well, having lived it as a founder, and then how that's influenced how you think about it as an investor.
Yeah. As an investor, I would like to think that I am brave enough to have the conversation and upfront, but because I can share a story that's real, I can get it on a real level with a founder. So you put a strategy around it. If this person, which is a founder who has so much drive and love to deliver something important to the world, you wrap around them and you support them to bring out the best in them, whatever that looks like. And you have a strategy around it, right? Like you have a strategy around your financials, like you have a strategy around how you network. Like, they're all just pieces of the puzzle. But to put it under the rug, like we do in New Zealand or have, or in the UK, and ignore it, you know what? Amazing. How can we empower each other to really drive them forward and know that I've got your back as an investor? And guess what? You pick up that phone, darling, and you tell me how you're feeling right now. And I will give you some answers to support you through that. And you make your own decisions with your partner, because God knows your partner is important to this whole journey and should never be forgotten, because you won't succeed without good, solid partnerships, significant others around you.
And I think it's so true. And when a lot of the time, I think we've still got this, because there is this like weird power dynamic of feeling like you're going and asking for money. I think a lot of founders I speak to, put it this way, the best investors I've spoken to, in my opinion, that I would want backing me are the ones who want to be told when things are hard, not because they want to be able to panic and steer your ship for you, but because they care and they want to support you, because they've been through the highs and the lows and they know what it feels to be in it. And that empathy is not to be underestimated from a founder. And I heard this beautiful line the other day, I can't remember where from, but it was this concept of we're all quite comfortable, although we're not good at doing it in the modern day, but we're all quite comfortable with this idea of it takes a village to raise a child. What about it takes a village to raise a company?
100%. 100%. I didn't do anything I did by myself. And sometimes I selfishly went down selfish paths because I was so driven to an end point. And that's a typical founder come COO come A-type personality. And that was the way I operated. But it takes a village. And so on that side is, yes, support founders, but founders, you need to know when to use your village. So check yourself on it too, right? Don't be some freaking hero or selfish because you think you must prove. You're doing yourself a disservice, and you're doing your company and your community a disservice.
And so many times, and I think we've talked about this on past episodes, but I have friends who'll have businesses that I know are going through a rocky patch, and I happen to know their investors as well, and their investors will be like, oh, how are you doing? And I'm like, oh yeah. And they're like, I haven't heard from them in a while. And you're like, oh. And they're like, I know that that's because they're struggling. And you're like, I'm not going to confirm or deny, but and they'll just say to me, can you just let them know that I'm here for them and that they don't need to hide it? Because this is the other thing, is investors know when you go quiet, it's not normally because you're just having like success after success. It's because you're struggling. And so you're not actually protecting anything. You're just leaving yourself alone to solve it. To your point, you're like trying to be a hero. And that's, if you bought on the right investors for the right reasons, you're literally leaving like your A team, your like emergency response team, and they're on the side. And you're like, I know I can't breathe, but I'm not going to call the ambulance yet. No, call them.
That's what they're there for. That's what they should be there for. We need to change this investor community model a little bit. We need to really help it step up. And it doesn't know unless it has people like me in the community, or people like yourself, or people sharing stories. It's not going to happen overnight, but you're absolutely right. One of is a key word here I wanted to throw in. It's around psychological safety. And we talk about that a lot in business, right, with employees. But why does it have to be an internal thing? How do we create psychological safety with our external stakeholders? And that's such an important factor to consider. It takes a bit of maturity and understanding. But there's some really good stuff out there around asking certain questions to set up trust and et cetera, and build trust around those relationships. So how do we do that as well?
I think you're spot on. And also like letting go of some of the ego that we have to come up with all the solutions in our startup. That's not how the great ones have done it. And it's certainly not a smart way. You're working harder, not smarter.
Yeah, no. Ego's a block and a barrier big time. There's no doubt about it.
So coming back to your third business, you said that this was obviously a really long business. You were in it 8 years, and you said that this is where some of the challenges started to emerge. So you've done this initial founder matching where you've talked about values alignment, hustle alignment, somebody can make things happen, and the family alignment, which I love. Where do things start to get challenging, and what are some of your reflections having been out of that?
Yeah, good question. I think some of the challenges are around, just like when you're starting to scale any company, resource money. So that's one. New Zealand is a completely different ecosystem from what you get here in the UK. So that was a big challenge. And it forced us, even though Kiwis are used to thinking global from the get-go, because we have to in order to have success in a tech world, our market cannot be our home market of 5 million people. It's too small, right? So you think big. We have limitations in our investor community, and I'm talking 15 years ago. I don't think it's changed that much. When you have 5 million people, you've got a couple of VCs, you've got maybe 100 retail investors, angels, and you've got an amazing, smart community of incredible entrepreneurs, and we're renowned for that. I'm not talking about me, I'm talking about these developers and engineers, and these ideas that are coming out of New Zealand are fantastic. So, yeah, I found with who's on location, the raising money piece was really challenging as a starting point. And then the executing piece offshore into the US market was challenging, but it had some end pieces that made it fulfilling, like an exit that you think back and go, oh, okay, stamp. Whew. But still.
And were there moments when, because obviously I think hindsight is 2020, but were there moments in it where you thought, we've messed this up? Those moments where you're like, oh, I've ruined the whole business now.
Yeah, all the time. And right at the beginning, we're guessing every step of the way. And I don't know who doesn't. What are we going to prioritize? And we've got no money. What are the proof points that we're going in the right direction? Which bank is going to support us? What are the banks offshore that can help us with multi-currency pieces, because we went into 30 countries pretty quickly. And we needed to hold different accounts offshore and all this sort of stuff. And things like being fit for purpose versus perfect, all these sorts of pieces. You don't know the stuff at the front end, and you're always asking and always guessing. But that's what I did a lot of as COO, is I'm an extrovert. I love engaging outside of the business. So I'd find the answers quickly and I'd plug the holes and I'd go, is this good enough? And I'd share it with my team and we go, is this good enough? And we give it a go. And then you start getting into these pieces like, oh, data, let's prove it, without making assumptions on it. And then you test the assumptions and you get better at what you do.
Spot on. And I think, I mean, it's exactly why the name for the podcast exists, right? No founder that I've met does the idea like survive in its initial guess perfectly. Okay, so you exit that business, so the stress is worth it.
The exit didn't come for years later, though, in fairness.
Okay.
And I wasn't there when I had some troubles. After 8 years, I got disillusioned and burned out again. And I had set up, I'd been tasked with and wanted to go and set up and test our business in the US, a test phase. And that meant going in and out of the US on a strategy that I'd set up with the team, 3 weeks in, 2 weeks out for over 6 or 7 months. Wow. And that was really intense. So we stuck to the plan. But I came back after that and I was just like, what am I doing? And my eldest son, he was only 7 at the time, got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes.
Oh, gosh.
And that was intense. And then a month and a half later, my youngest son at age 4 fractured his right femur. And I just couldn't keep going in and being away from my family with these sorts of family challenges going on. And I realized at that point I've been in the game too long and in this business too long. And I don't know if I can serve it the way I really want to anymore. I've done my job, sort of end point. So I ended up pulling out of the business. The beautiful piece was that I negotiated a few pieces and managed to get enough of paid back what was owed so that we could set up the next stage of our life, which was to come to the UK, which is amazing. So a very supportive team, very supportive founder in Darren. And the exit came 2 years later. And I was lucky to still be the third biggest shareholder. So I did some things right, but it's tough.
And I actually think there's something in there again that we're not talking enough about as an ecosystem, which is this piece of how much of your identity gets attached to I am the co-founder of this company. And that muddies actually whether it's the right place for you still to be. And I think there's an interesting balance. I think two sides that are under talked about. One is I think people who want to own their own companies and then go down the venture capital route, not realizing that actually suddenly you can be fired if they decide you're not the right person for the job, which I think is a danger. But there's also, I think, the risk that you try and stay in your business because you feel like you should be the next role as it's growing. But actually the bits that you loved and that energized you and that you were good at actually don't evolve at that rate, and that's not a failure. That's just a fact. And I think I'd love if you could unpack maybe a little bit more on your experience of that and how hard that was to work out to step away because of the lack of enjoyment. Because I guess the family side gives it some pressing kind of environmental reasons to step back. But the kind of side of you that was like, this is now a totally different role.
Yeah. I was struggling with the whole balance thing. There ever is a balance. And, with 2 young kids, to be blunt, didn't have sperm on tap, Hattie. Started really late.
Yeah.
And, was 41 when I had my second child. And had started in a new business and was doing those things. Now, the New Zealand ecosystem, unless you were self-employed, you didn't get funding from the government for maternal leave. I started back after day 5. And I burnt out. And I went into postnatal depression very quickly. I made the decision to go on to antidepressants. That affected me for the rest of my life, and not so far in the last 10 years, and not necessarily for a good thing. So I wasn't I wasn't the person I needed to be at my best for my family, nor was I for the company. And I put some of those people in the business and Darren through a lot of shit. And I know that in hindsight, your team and your family, and you do your bit. It was right for me to leave because I was hurting myself and I'm probably hurting others as well. It's easy to say in hindsight. So to your point, there's a lot of stuff that goes on. I needed to step away. I think the business knew I needed to. I was fit for purpose. I'd done my job. I also wasn't delivering to my family the way I needed to for their stage in the next life. So it was just a smart thing to do. It didn't feel smart at the time because there's ego and there's identity, big time. But I was having all those shift and challenges of identity at the same time as well. And I didn't want to let go of what I knew, which is I know how to found a company. I know how to execute. I know how to deliver and hold the reins and people will follow. So no, Victoria, it doesn't always work that way.
Do you think that was harder having already done it twice because you had them? Was there a part of you that kind of had maybe higher expectations of yourself or was being harsher on yourself for that reason?
Absolutely. I had not achieved anywhere near what I wanted to at that stage. Now, this is going back at 2017 about. And so what's that? That's only 6 years ago. So I was 44. And no, I was nowhere near achieving. I'm still young. I'm still vibrant. I still got lots to go. What am I doing? Am I giving up? I don't give up. I don't give up. I haven't achieved what I want to, but I had to force myself out too, or else.
And it's so impossible because I feel like being a founder, to be a successful founder, you have to have, I guess, two things, I believe. Like one is you have to have a really low propensity for giving up because otherwise you just wouldn't do it. And you have to have a slight, what was the word? One of my great founder friends told me it's like, you basically just have to be delusional because if you look at the stats, you're definitely going to fail. So you have to, believe you have to be arrogant enough to believe you're going to be exceptional, but you also tend to have this deep inner insecurity that means you're trying to prove yourself enough. Like so many conflicting pieces that kind of form whether we push forward and stay founders. But yeah, I think that then is a really hard piece of knowing when to let it go. And as you say, whether that's like stepping back out of the business or whether that's actually like folding the business.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to have a couple of founders actually come on in a few episodes and talk about the process of letting go and shutting down businesses because they didn't work. And I think one of the things that we hope to do with this podcast is to share lessons. But I think it's one of those things that you can't give a lesson on. And I'd love your thoughts on, I guess, just coming to terms with stepping away as much as anything, not because I expect you to have an answer that's repeatable for others, but because I think it's nice to feel less alone that you're going through the struggle.
There's something in our innate wiring as founders that I've learned it's very hard to dial down and turn off. If you're a serial founder, if it's naturally in you. Mine is, to your point, it's a tenacity, it's a perseverance. It's a rod for your back as well. It's a strength and it's a weakness.
Yeah.
And you will drive and drive. And an example of it is outside of business. I was playing tennis on Sunday, filling in for some friends. And I don't play very often. I pick up the racket. Within the first 5 minutes, I felt something go in my forearm. It was a little twinge. Did I stop? No. I went for 2 hours. I couldn't hit a backhand. I couldn't hold the racket at the end. What did Victoria feel she had to prove? So I took it to my therapist that night, Hattie, and he said, let's unpick that, Victoria. I'm like, this is deja vu all over my life, all over my life. When do you so know how? It's not about when. I think there's wins all along the way. The question is, how do you say no? How do you understand and have the self-awareness? I've got enough self-awareness at 50. I still chose to deliberately not let down my teammates and win. So I don't have all the answers in that. I'm probably not the best person to help others, unfortunately.
But I do think there's a lot in there, and I think just sharing it is helpful. And I think also the other thing that I think is really lovely is that, and I heard on Valentina Milanova's episode, so founder of Day, she talks about how being a founder, one of her big challenges is, and she's been a solo founder since the beginning of that business. So like also carrying the weight of it all alone. And we were talking about how she adapted as the business has grown. And she said for her, it's like weekly therapy, weekly coaching.
Yeah.
And I do think there's this really nice piece of actually, to your point, when like hurt people and stress people. And I think as founders, you are always stressed. But if you're carrying a ton of other unworked through baggage, then you are going to bring it to work and you're going to put it on other people. And actually seeing it as part of your role as a founder and a leader is to like work on your own stuff, I think is really powerful. And even if we don't have to have it all worked out, this stuff goes deep, but awareness, reflection, the ability, like if that had been a work day, you could have walked away from the end of the work day and gone and spoken to a therapist, as opposed to just carrying on the behavior for months. And I think that's the shift.
Yeah, and look, well put to her and to you. If there's one thing I could do differently, it would have had started therapy a lot earlier in my life. And the second thing, create space and respect for myself around that. Nurture myself. To be founder fit and to be sustainable takes a lot of consideration, and it should, not just intellectual consideration. And part of what drives me these days is trying to understand how to support others in being founder fit, or understand their stories to enable them to be founder fit. It's got very little to do with picking up weights and jumping on a treadmill, believe me, but helping people around that gets me going.
So let's talk about the kind of final business that you started. It is 4, right? I've not skipped one.
You're good. That's more than enough.
So the final business, let's briefly touch on how you got into it and whether there are any big learnings that you've taken from that to how you now support founders.
I said before this business, I was saying, I'm not founding again. That's it. I know what I want, but more importantly, I know what I don't want. So then I go into this business business name, Aphrodite Health. Fantastic name. We were, because we are no longer there, a psychedelic in business. It's about using psychedelics to help women's hormones across their lifespan. Biotechnology. Think going through FDA using psychedelics, which is this whole new market. It's nothing to do with cannabis, everything to do with, stuff. And it was fantastic. So it excited me immensely because I knew that there's this new market emerging and it's already been tested in a few ways out of the US. And in my 6 years at university, it's all around health and science and all these pieces. It just had a natural alignment. And then perimenopausal, I'm like, hello. So you start putting these pieces together and I'm feeling mission aligned. Very hard to dial someone like me down if you've got those pieces staring you in the face. And so turning to my wife going, what do you think? And she's, I know you, Victoria. And so we jumped on board. And it was fantastic for a while. But you know what? I learned more in that short window, this is about 2 years ago. So much more, and some hard learnings and some scars that I didn't think I would learn and feel at 48. I didn't think I would. And it's a sad story in some ways because I was mission aligned and I had the rug pulled out from under me. And there's certain parts of it I can't talk about. It was a US-based business. And certain parts I can't talk about because there's a lot going on still behind the scenes. I was a co-founder, COO, had to step into a C role, director on the board. And I also invested in the fund that was incubating companies like Aphrodite House, and there are quite a few of them. So I was an LP hat as well. And I saw a lot of things that went on that were not right. And so that business ended for a variety of different reasons. There are a lot of things to learn. I'm not a naive woman. I'm pretty brave, but I did make 1 or 2 mistakes. And I think the world is hard. It can be hurtful. And again, how do you get out of that? How do you unpick it? You share stories. It's the only way. And just so that others don't get hurt, right? So I don't think I'll found again, Hattie.
I so don't believe any serial founder that says that, but I hope maybe, I don't know if I do hope, but if that works for you, I'm thrilled.
Thank you.
Are there any, appreciating there's a lot you can't talk about for understandable
Sure.
reasons, are there any kind of lessons that you learned that you can speak about? Maybe I'm curious as well if we can touch on it, the experiences in LP, because I think one of the things that founders is really tricky is that we're not honest enough with founders about like how the venture model actually works. And so if you're going to a system to ask for money and you fundamentally don't understand its business model, then you won't understand why it's asking for certain things, or why actually it might not be the right fit for you, or why it might be really the right fit for you. And I think for anyone who wants to go deeper on this, Zoe Pedden's episode, she's called Behind the Venture Capital Curtain, does talk about this in a lot of detail, but would love your experience as a first-time LP and also anything you can share on the business learnings.
Yeah, sure. There's a few things there. Look, just on a very fine point, read all the legal documents right up front in the business and get experienced eyes on them. I was an experienced COO and founder, and there were some little pieces there, right? You need to know how to protect yourself. But you go into these things, I did naturally with an open heart. And I think that's a really important piece to remember, is to go into business with an open heart. It's about connection, it's about learning, it's about growing. I don't regret any of the stuff because I've gone in with an open heart, and that's how I learn best, right? But the vulnerability piece can be taken for granted, and that's a real shame.
Yeah.
And whether or not you're a founder or an LP or whatever, you've got to be kind to yourself, because as I said earlier, there's consequences. So don't take the hits. Scars have a story, right? Every scar. I've had 3 ankle reconstructions. I've got stories around each one of those. But then there's the internal scars, right? So share those stories. I do a lot more angel investing than I do as an LP, because I'm an LP in that other business still. I am wary of where I put my effort, of hand over my money, my output, my resources to LP funds. I've been asked to plenty of times. I'm not comfortable with it yet. That's my personal stance. So I prefer to go down the angel path, more direct and less safe, people would say. But for me, it feels more safe because I understand startup, pre-seed, seed, Series A. Those are the risks that I'm comfortable with.
And I think it's a really helpful for anyone who doesn't know what an LP is. These are basically the people who will put money into a venture fund. And so you're then trusting someone else to essentially invest your money for you in startups. And typically why venture funds behave the way they do, the fund managers and the team, is because they're answerable to those LPs. So they will invest based on a thesis those LPs have agreed to. So they get those investors, a bit like you will go and pitch for funding to a VC. VCs have gone and pitched for funding to LPs to say, we really think this space is interesting. Will you allow us to invest your money here? And then they also have made commitments to those LPs about when they'll return that money. So the length of time they have to both spend the capital, and typically because of the time it takes for those startups to mature and hopefully get to an exit, which means they can return the money, and they can only return the money, remember, if there's that liquidation event, whether that's a private acquisition or an IPO. They've also promised quite high returns to those LPs because it's a really risky business. So they're targeting companies that can make huge returns. And I think all of that's really important to understand when you go and talk to a VC and they say you're not big enough or you're in the wrong space. Why are they saying that? Or it's going to be too long to exit. Or maybe they've actually just deployed their capital because funds roll in cycles where they'll spend most of it early and then they're supporting their portfolio ventures to reach that maturity because they're trying to pay back LPs in 7 years roughly. So all of these things I think are really helpful context to just understand the system you're trying to access capital from and why it's behaving the way it's behaving. Just for anyone who doesn't understand what we're talking about, that's maybe a bit of useful context.
Well done, Hattie. 100% that, And coming to the investment side, I started prior to investment learning about these things in a market in New Zealand, as I said earlier, that didn't have a lot of money, and they didn't have that 1 to 5 million sort of area to help fuel good companies. And so you felt like your legs were cut off at the knees, right? When you really needed an injection to support you. And so there's a couple of angels around there. But over here in this ecosystem is so different. The things that I've over in the comparisons are really interesting. And you can do it differently over here. One of the things I learned when I first came into this market 4 years ago was, it may sound really intense, but there's money for jam here. It's hanging off the trees. compared to New Zealand, it was like, oh my God.
And I think, again, like just so much of what we've spoken about in this episode, I think can be also condensed back into angel investors are people who are like Victoria, you're spending your own money, but you're then getting involved in the company and supporting the founders. And you want to be looking for people who you want on your, like, think of it like you're picking a team, and it's not just like you're picking the guy whose dad owns a private jet, so he'll take you on the private jet. No, I don't actually want him on my team. I want someone I like can trust that when the going gets tough, they will back me and they will be in my corner and they will support me emotionally and practically. And so often it's tempting because there is this feeling of like, and at the moment it is hard to fundraise, and I have so much empathy for those trying at the moment, but don't just take money, take smart money. And that's why they're called angels, is that they're in theory bringing deep, rich experience and lessons. And I think what you've done such a beautiful job, Victoria, which I just feel like more founders need to hear this episode just to get this, the heart that a great investor can bring you is so powerful. Someone you genuinely want to call and say, I'm having a really tough time. And I saw at one of my other favorite angels, someone was talking about having a hard time on LinkedIn, and they were being quite authentic about sharing what hard time they've been through. And he's not even an angel investor in them. And he said, call me anytime. I'm DMing you my number now. I've been through these tough moments. And that's the kind of mentality you want, not someone who's going to make it more stressful for you in those, because you will have those times.
It's a given.
So final couple of quick fire questions for you. We've covered a lot. I want to briefly talk about what you're up to now, because I know you're on to, as well as being an angel investor, you're also super involved with Female Founders Rise. And last week we had Emmy on the episode. So really lovely tie in there. And I'm also an advisory member for Female Founders Rise. I love what they do. So maybe if you can share what you're up to now and why you're excited about it.
Yeah, thank you. It's a real privilege to be on the advisory board of Female Founders Rise with Emmy. She's an incredible woman with so much. She's found her thing, right? She's such a connector, and she knows her sweet spot, and she knows how to deliver. To be around that sort of energy when someone's mission focused, you're just in their slipstream, right? So it's not hard to give. It's not hard to give. And she wants to learn and she wants to grow. And it's all about her community, or the community of female founders. And a mission that is how to enable financial freedom for women through entrepreneurship. An amazing mission. And so it takes nothing for me to get on board that and energized to do it and step in however I'm needed to. As long as I'm serving and adding value, this is another important piece. As a founder, as an ex-founder, I should say, I just want to have impact. But I need to know what that means. And if I'm not serving that person or that place, tell me. Or I need to be psychologically secure enough to ask the question, am I still serving a purpose here? Otherwise, step away. Female Founders does that for me, and it's been going for 5 months there. The other thing I do, angel investing, which I love. And the types of businesses and people, I'm quite agnostic, to be honest, in the types of businesses. But it's the people as much, clearly. So someone with a sort of, I don't want to say a mirror to myself, because that's just friggin' egotistical. There's a certain something about a founder that you want to back and precede seed, right? That's that perseverance. I want to see strong and hear strong listening skills, sort of proof of success in some other way, adaptability, and a self-awareness, sort of lead thyself attitude. These pieces are what I find very investable. And a bit of a bent towards a SaaS B2B, B2C, and just aligning a few of those. And they're starting to hit the marks for me in my checkbook. And the third thing is I am consulting and doing but put advising and mentoring aside, because I do a lot of that. But in terms of consulting, companies up to 100 head count, founders, startup, the obvious stuff that you've probably heard through today's session is, how can I support founders do what they do better? How can I help them be sustainable? How can I help them influence up to a board, across to their team, internally, externally? How to make them better, support them in being better? What does that look like for them? What does success look like? And bringing that whole organic, that ecosystem of holistic and family into it too. And if I can do that with businesses, then I feel like I'm having impact. And that feels really fulfilling for me.
And I think just picking up on that final point, anyone who's going and speaking to an angel, this is the other thing that we get wrong, is we forget to paint the picture for them of the impact they can create. And that's part of what gets you excited to invest is I'm not just doing this because it's the smartest. It's like a really risky way to invest your money. You're doing it because you want to be on the journey. So bring that to life for them.
Yeah, let me bring my open heart to you in an honest way, and which I would always do. And it may not be all the things you want to hear, but it'll be said with openness and a good heart. And I think that's the genuine side that founders need to hear sometimes.
100%. Which brings us on to our final questions. Final two, quick fire round. One is, what is the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Oh, by far, and I share this a lot, have fun. Because if you're not having fun, then they aren't. And it relates to connection and engagement, right? Wherever you put yourself, have fun. It's important.
So powerful and so easy to forget when you're in the stress of it. Second question, last question. What is your proudest moment? And it can be as a founder, it can be as an investor, you pick, but what is your favorite, proudest moment?
It would be, to date, setting up the US arm and executing for Who's on Location in market and testing that strategy. Took a lot of guts and a lot of output, but I know that the relationships and the team that we built over there were instrumental in the eventual acquisition of Who's on Location. I may not have been there at the end, but I'm proud because as a Kiwi, I could say on one hand how many Kiwi companies have been acquired by US businesses. So that puts me in a place of going, yeah, job done. Feel good about it.
Amazing. Victoria, thank you for sharing so candidly as ever. I just adore your energy. So it's just been such a pleasure speaking, and I know there'll be so much for listeners to take away from this. We'll put notes in the show notes for where to find Victoria and follow her on LinkedIn, as well as obviously references. So do check those out if you have any questions. And Victoria, thank you again for your time.
The pleasure's all mine. Hetty, I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for taking the time with me.
Thank you for listening. Shows like ours grow when listeners like you shout about us from the rooftops. So if you're feeling extra generous today, why not share your favourite episode or your top takeaway from this one on social media, in a WhatsApp chat with fellow founders, or any Slack groups you're in. And don't forget to tag us online. And for those of you curious what I get up to when not interviewing founders for this show, I have a new startup, If We Raise, aiming to get expertise and capital to underrepresented founders earlier. You can follow what my co-founder Tim and I are up to via @IfWeRaiseTogether on Instagram or @IfWeRaise on LinkedIn and Twitter. We'll be sharing our lessons learned along the way, as well as highlighting the incredible founders and angel investors joining the If We Raise journey.